Russia's defense ministry says it's thwarted an attack on Moscow by 3 Ukrainian drones. The strike damaged an office building several kilometres from the Kremlin. Another drone strike on a police station was reported overnight in the Russian border region of Briansk. Ukraine's president says the attacks show the war is returning to Russian territory.
The drone attack on central Moscow, captured on a mobile phone.
I filmed it. Dear Mommy, let's get out of here right now.
We are leaving tomorrow. We're not staying here.
Russian officials say this Moscow office block was damaged by 2 drones, which crashed into the building after they were electronically jammed.
My friends and I rented an apartment to come here and unwind. And at some point, we heard an explosion and it was like a wave. Everyone jumped. And then there was a lot of smoke and you couldn't see anything. From above, you could see fire.
A third drone was shot down on the outskirts of the city, forcing one of Moscow's international airports to close. After similar attacks early in the week, Kyiv warned there would be more to come. President Volodymyr Zelensky says it's only fair Russia should face more of such strikes.
Gradually, the war is returning to the territory of Russia, to its symbolic centers and military bases. And this is an inevitable, natural and absolutely fair process.
Attacks on Moscow make the war in Ukraine more visible for many Russians, but dissenting voices are quickly silenced. The Kremlin is cracking down on criticism, with President Putin warning there are certain rules to follow.
It's the year 2023, and Russia is engaged in an armed conflict with a neighbor. And I think that there should be a certain attitude towards people who harm us inside the country.
The attack on Moscow came just before Russia's Navy Day celebrations. The strong military showing, seemingly undeterred by attacks on its home soil.
Well, for more, let's bring in Dmity Ponyavin. What have you been hearing as far as people in Moscow go and the reaction to these attacks?
Well, Ben, first there's a bit of context. So as we heard in this report, Zelensky said that the war is coming back at Russia and Ukraine is now targeting some of the symbolic centers in that area in central Moscow where the attack happened on Sunday morning is what you describe as the Manhattan or the London city. It's the financial hub or what they were trying to build there as. And it's been a showcase of its rise in economic power in the decade before. And so it has these trendy offices. Actually, many foreign companies had their offices there. Many of them have left now. So we would describe it as a very upscale area. Mm-hmm. So if somebody planned it to be symbolic, that actually is symbolic. In terms of the reactions, what we see from social media and people that were interviewed on the streets of Moscow, we can easily describe it as mixed. So on one hand, as we heard from the girl in that video who actually filmed the moment when the drone hit the building, she was screaming and obviously panicking and trying to ask her mother to get out of this place as soon as possible. And the mother coming her down and saying, we're leaving tomorrow, we're not staying here, it's too dangerous. So on one hand, you have people panicking and scared, obviously. And on the other hand, what we have seen for now, well, there's been some damage and there was one person injured, but these are not exactly the scenes that we see almost every day coming from Ukraine. Yeah. So I guess the reality that the war is coming back in Russia is coming to many Russians in a way too slowly. And even if what they see for now is the kind of small incidents, with lack of casualties. And But
is that how Russia's communicating the attack to the public, that it's just a small incident?
Well, yeah, exactly. Not surprisingly, media broadcasters, which have been in many ways responsible for creating this sense of security and stability in Putin's Russia over the last 2 decades, they chose to focus in a very small way or not at all on the attacks in Moscow. Like, for example, just before coming here, I watched briefly this morning show on the website of Russia's largest state broadcaster, Первый канал, which is the first channel. So they had reports about Russia's offensive operation in Ukraine. They showed helicopters attacking Ukrainian nationalists. They showed artillery in action. They showed the Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk. So that attack on Moscow on Sunday was not mentioned. So if I were the person who only gets information from the state TV, I would actually never know that it happened.
Interesting stuff. Dmity, Ponyavin, thank you very much for coming in and breaking down that story for us. Well, Moscow has remained tight-lipped, as you heard about there, about the impact the war is having on its troops, but independent experts have been looking into it. Let's have a look at some of the figures. Moscow says it planned to beef up its military this year from around 1 million to 1.5 million. According to independent data, there's an estimated 1.3 million. That figure includes active personnel, reservists and paramilitary forces. In September of last year, President Putin announced the mobilization of 300,000 troops. Russia has said it doesn't need a mass mobilization, but last week's increase in the maximum age of conscription from 27 to 30 years of age is substantial. Moscow has released no data on the number of troops it's deployed against Ukraine. Earlier this year, Ukrainian military intelligence claimed it stood around 280,000. The British Defence Ministry said this year that 97% of the Russian army is in Ukraine. Moscow's publicly acknowledged the deaths of only 6,000 soldiers. Russian media outlets, working with a data scientist from Germany's Tübingen University, put the number at close to 50,000. Now, there's no data on the number of people who've deserted the Russian army, but human rights groups say there are more than 1,000 court cases against alleged Russian deserters. Some rights groups claim the figure could be higher. Recent moves by the government indicate Russia needs even more troops. Along with raising the recruit cutoff age to 30, Moscow has also made it harder to leave the country for people who've been drafted or who refuse to fight. The official reason is that the country needs better defences.
Russia needs more experienced, meaning older, soldiers. At least that's how its parliament justified raising the minimum and maximum recruitment ages for the army. Until now, men between 18 and 27 were enlisted. In the future, they say, citizens between 21 and 30 years old will be called up for military service. That was the plan a month ago. But the final law that passed only raised the upper limit without changing the minimum age as previously stated. The parliament's defense chief called it a necessary step to create a better force. We considered all the advantages and disadvantages and came to the decision that it's better this way. We always need a well-prepared mobilization reserve. Critics reading between the lines say Moscow needs more soldiers, and in a hurry.
At the moment, Russia is lacking of troops. These resources need to come from somewhere. For example, men over the age of 27. Now, they've been chosen as victims.
The new law means Russia's army could grow by an estimated 2 million. Officials say the recruits will not be sent to fight in Ukraine, but many are afraid that's exactly the fate that awaits them, as reinforcements for the front line. The Kremlin hasn't commented on the new law, referring questions to the Defense Ministry instead. But some parliamentarians are clearer. They even refer to the fighting in Ukraine as a war, and not a special military operation. This law was written for general mobilization and large-scale war. It already smells like large-scale war. A war which rights organizations say more and more Russian men are trying to escape.
There are more than 1,000 cases against deserters since the first mobilization began. At the same time, it's clear that by no means they are all being investigated. It's very costly, and also the whole mobilization mechanism is running quite badly. In reality, the number of deserters is much higher.
Now, even more men of recruitment age are likely to try to get out of Russia as soon as they can. Because once they've received their conscription order, they're required to stay in the country. Since those orders are now sent out digitally, there's no escaping them anymore.
Well, let's talk about this with Marina Moron, a military analyst at King's College London. Welcome. What's your take on the Russian statement that increasing the conscription age is more about recruiting more experienced fighters?
Good morning. Well, we have to understand this against the background that Russia has been trying to increase the size of its armed forces to 1.5 million. And now, with the war in Ukraine, Russia hasn't expected the kind of losses that it is facing, and it is very difficult to estimate. So essentially, after the partial mobilization, what we're seeing now is that some issues have been identified, such as those associated with the lack of non-commissioned officers. They do not exist in the Russian armed forces. Therefore, there is also a lack of skill, not just a lack of manpower. And this law, or these two laws, are trying to fill that gap. On the other hand, these laws are also trying to prepare the population for a possibly longer war by trying to increase the armed forces and making the conditions harsher, such as fines for those who are drafted and do not appear, and also forming paramilitary groups to mobilize people.
What will this change to the recruiting age mean for Ukraine's effort in defending itself? I mean, does this make it easier or harder?
Well, it is difficult to tell at this stage how this is going to go for the Russians, because the law is not going to be in force for some months. Therefore, there will not be any immediate changes. However, what it indicates is that Russia is preparing for possibly another round of mobilizations. And in the long term, obviously, Russia is preparing for hostilities to last for more than just several years. And this is why this law is needed. At the same time, they're trying to fix the underlying problems on the go in terms of the command structure and the skill level of those deployed to Ukraine, as well as the flexibility of their armed forces.
I also mentioned just a moment ago the huge difference in the number of the death toll and also the number of deserters from Russia. NGOs and Moscow are revealing very different numbers. Can you help us understand how to get reliable information out of Russia on those figures?
Well, out of Russia, it is very difficult to get reliable information because the official statistics will try not to disclose the actual numbers. However, there are some independent NGOs, both from the Russian side and in the West, which offer numbers. There are also intelligence estimates coming from Britain and the United States. So we can triangulate and look at all those numbers and calculate the mean to get a better idea, because all those numbers differ. It is possibly the only way, but how accurate that number is questionable at best.
Sure. Marina Moron, thank you very much for chiming in here on DW News.
Thank you for having me.